The rifle barrel never wavered as Cordelia Thorne pressed her back against the cabin door. Watching the two massive figures dismount from their war ponies, lightning split the Oklahoma sky, illuminating the Apache warriors who stood nearly 7 feet tall, their shoulders broad as barn doors. Rain cascaded from their long black hair as they approached her porch, hands raised in the universal gesture of peace. "We seek shelter from the storm, white woman," the taller one called out, his voice carrying over the thunder. Water streamed down his bronze chest, and Cordelia's grip tightened on her Winchester. She had lived alone in this forgotten corner of the territory for 3 years, ever since her husband's death, and no living soul had crossed her threshold. "State your names," she demanded, though her voice betrayed a tremor she despised. "I am Nalnish," the speaker replied, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "This is my brother, Bidzil. We mean no harm to the widow of this place." The second warrior stepped forward, and Cordelia noticed how differently he moved where Nalnish carried himself with the fluid grace of a predator. Bidzil seemed gentler, his massive frame somehow less threatening. When he spoke, his English was softer, more careful. "Our horses are spent, and the creek runs dangerous. We ask only for dry ground until dawn." A particularly violent crack of thunder made Cordelia's cabin shudder, and she saw their mounts pawing nervously in her yard. These men could have simply taken what they wanted. Her small frame would be no match for either of them, yet they stood in the downpour, waiting for permission. "The barn," she said finally, lowering her rifle. "You can shelter there. There's grain for your horses." Nalnish nodded curtly and turned toward the outbuilding, but Bidzil remained, studying her face in the flickering lightning. "You have shown kindness to strangers. This will be remembered." As they led their horses away, Cordelia barred her door and sank into her rocking chair by the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she watched the warm glow of their small fire in the barn. It had been so long since she'd heard human voices that weren't her own conversations with the chickens or her old hound, Duke. Her husband, Micah, had chosen this isolated homestead specifically to avoid contact with others, both white settlers and native tribes. After his death from fever, she'd maintained the isolation out of habit and fear. But now, staring at the barn where the warriors waited out the storm, Cordelia felt something she hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about another human being. The storm raged through the night, and she found herself unable to sleep, wondering about the two men who had appeared like figures from a dream. When morning came, would they simply vanish back into the wilderness, leaving her to question whether they had been real at all? Thunder rolled across the plains, and in its echo, Cordelia thought she heard the sound of her carefully constructed solitude beginning to crack. Dawn broke clear and crisp, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Cordelia emerged from her cabin to find Bidzil already at work, repairing the section of her chicken coop fence that had blown down in the night. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy as he rewove the wire, and Duke sat watching him with the contentment of a dog who had found a new friend. "You didn't need to do that," Cordelia said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Bidzil looked up, and she was struck by the warmth in his dark eyes. In daylight, she could see the scars that marked his chest and arms, testimony to battles fought and survived. Yet there was no hardness in his expression, only a quiet strength that made her feel oddly safe. "A debt must be repaid," he said simply. "You gave shelter when you could have turned us away." From the barn came the sound of Nalnish preparing their horses. He emerged leading both animals, his movements sharp and efficient, where his brother moved like still water. Nalnish was all controlled energy, like a blade held in check. "We ride south today," Nalnish announced. "Our people wait." But Bidzil had finished with the fence and was now examining the sagging corner of Cordelia's porch roof. "This will not last another storm season," he observed. "I know," Cordelia admitted. "I've been meaning to fix it," but she trailed off, unwilling to confess her inexperience with such work. "Brother," Nalnish's voice carried a warning note, "we cannot linger. The roof will take half a day to secure properly." Bidzil replied without looking up. "Would you have us leave a woman to face the winter winds with broken shelter?" Something passed between the brothers, a communication deeper than words. Nalnish's jaw tightened, But he nodded curtly. Half a day, no more. As Bidzil set to work, Cordelia found herself drawn into conversation. She learned that they were traveling from their winter camp to join a larger band for the spring hunt, that they were the sons of a respected war chief, and that Bidzil had once lived among white traders and learned their language and customs. "Why did you return to your people?" she asked, bringing him water as he worked under the strengthening sun. "A man must know where he belongs," he said, accepting the cup with hands that dwarfed her own. "But sometimes the heart sees a different path than the one the feet have walked." Their eyes met over the rim of the cup, and Cordelia felt a jolt of recognition, not of his face, but of something deeper. Here was another soul who understood isolation, who had chosen solitude, but perhaps wondered if that choice had been wise. "You speak as if you've been searching for something," she said softly. "Perhaps I have been," he replied. "Perhaps we all search, whether we admit it or not." From across the yard, Nalnish watched this exchange with growing unease. He had seen that look in his brother's eyes before, the softening that came when Bidzil's generous heart overruled his warrior's training. It had led to trouble before, and Nalnish feared it would again. The roof repair stretched into the afternoon, then became reinforcing the barn door, then checking the well pump. With each completed task, the tension in Nalnish's shoulders grew more pronounced, while something bloomed between Cordelia and Bidzil, a recognition of kindred spirits, finding each other across the vast loneliness of the frontier. 3 days had passed since the storm, yet the Apache brothers remained. Nalnish's patience had worn thin as his brother found endless small repairs around Cordelia's homestead, but something deeper troubled the younger warrior. He watched Cordelia emerge each morning with coffee for Bidzil, saw how his brother's severe features softened when she spoke, noticed how she no longer kept her rifle within arm's reach. "You forget yourself," Nalnish said on the 4th morning as they watered their horses at the creek. "And you forget our people." Bidzil's massive hands stilled on his mount's neck. "I forget nothing, brother. Then why do we remain in this place? The woman has shelter, food, and protection enough. Our duty is done. Perhaps my duty lies elsewhere now." The words hung between them like a blade. Nalnish had feared this moment since childhood, the day his brother's compassionate heart would lead him away from their people. Bidzil had always been different, drawn to healing rather than warfare, to building rather than raiding. Among the Apache, he was respected but never quite understood. "She is white," Nalnish said quietly. "You would become an exile for a woman you barely know." "Would I?" Bidzil turned to face his brother. "Or would I finally become myself?" Meanwhile, Cordelia stood at her cabin window, wrestling with her own impossible thoughts. The isolation that had once protected her now felt like a prison. For 3 years, she had spoken to no one but herself and her animals. Now, the sound of male laughter from her yard, the sight of someone else's horse in her corral, the knowledge that strong hands were nearby to help with the endless tasks of frontier life, it all felt like awakening from a long, cold sleep. But more than that, she found herself studying Bidzil's face when he thought she wasn't looking, memorizing the gentle way he spoke to her animals, the careful consideration he gave to every small kindness. In her husband's final delirium, he had begged her to find happiness again, to not waste her life mourning him. She had promised, never believing she would need to keep that vow. The moment of decision came that evening. Nalnish announced they would leave at first light, and Cordelia felt something crack inside her chest. She watched Bidzil's face go carefully blank, saw him nod acceptance of his brother's decree. After supper, as the brothers prepared their bedrolls in the barn, Cordelia found herself walking across the yard. Duke trotted beside her, sensing her agitation. She found Bidzil alone, grooming his horse by lamplight. "Will I see you again?" The words escaped before she could stop them. He stopped brushing and turned slowly. In the golden light, his scarred face looked like carved stone, but his eyes held infinite gentleness. "Would you want to?" "I think." Cordelia took a shaking breath. "I think I've been alone long enough." The brush fell from his hands, into strides. He crossed the space between them, his massive frame towering over her small form. But when he touched her face, his hands were infinitely gentle. I have wandered many paths, Cordelia Thorne, but none have led me to a place I wish to stay, until now." From the barn door came the sound of Nalnish clearing his throat. Both turned to find the warrior watching them, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Nalnish stepped forward. "My brother has made his choice," he said to Cordelia. "But understand, if he stays, he cannot easily return to our people. Are you prepared for what that means?" Cordelia looked up at Bidzil, seeing in his eyes the same fear and hope that warred in her own heart. "I know what it means to be alone," she said softly, "and I know what it means to find someone worth the risk." Nalnish departed alone the next morning. His goodbye to his brother brief, but weighted with unspoken emotion. "The path you choose will not be easy," he said, gripping Bidzil's shoulders, "but you have always walked differently than other men. Perhaps this is why." Cordelia watched from her porch as the warrior disappeared into the morning mist, knowing she might never see him again. The responsibility of that separation settled heavily on her shoulders. But when Bidzil returned to her side, his presence felt like coming home to a fire on a cold night. The early days of their life together proved Nalnish's warning prophetic. When the circuit preacher, Reverend Hoskins, arrived 2 weeks later for his monthly visit, he took one look at Bidzil and declared Cordelia's soul in mortal peril. The old man's sermon stretched to hours, filled with warnings about savage ways and the corruption of Christian virtue. "You'll find yourself scalped in your bed. Mark my words," Hoskins declared as he prepared to leave. "These people don't know civilized love, only animal urges." Cordelia's temper, dormant for years, flared bright. "Reverend, in 3 years of widowhood, no Christian man offered to repair my roof or tend my animals. The savage fixed everything, broken on my homestead, and asks nothing in return but kindness. Perhaps you should examine whose behavior is more Christ-like." The preacher left in a huff, but his visit proved to be the first of many challenges. When supply wagons stopped at her homestead, the drivers' reactions ranged from fear to disgust. Some refused to trade with her entirely. Others inflated their prices. Knowing her isolation left her few alternatives, Bidzil bore these insults with stoic dignity. But Cordelia saw how they cut him. One evening, after a particularly venomous encounter with a traveling merchant, she found him standing by the creek, staring into the water. "You regret staying," she said, joining him in the gathering darkness. "Never," he replied immediately, "but I regret the price you pay for my presence." "The price?" Cordelia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Bidzil, for 3 years I was dying by inches in that cabin. Every sunrise was a burden, every sunset a relief that another empty day had passed. Now I wake eager to see what we'll build together. If ignorant people want to judge us, let them. Their opinions don't keep us." Warm at night, he turned to study her face in the starlight. "You speak like a warrior, small woman." "I learned from the best teacher," she replied, stepping closer to his warmth. As autumn approached, their bond deepened beyond mere companionship. Bidzil taught Cordelia to read the weather signs, to preserve meat in the Apache way, to find edible plants others would pass by unseeing. She taught him to read English, to appreciate the poetry books that had sustained her through her lonely years, to see the beauty in small domestic rituals that warriors rarely valued. But their greatest test came with the first snow. A band of young white men, led by the sheriff's hot-headed son, arrived at her homestead with whiskey on their breath and righteousness in their voices. Double quotes Mrs. Thorne called out Jake Rutherford, dismounting with theatrical authority. "We've come to rescue you from this situation. Can't have a Christian woman living in sin with a savage." Cordelia emerged from the cabin with her rifle, Bidzil a silent presence at her shoulder. "Mr. Rutherford, I don't recall asking for rescue, and I'll thank you to refer to my husband with proper respect." "Husband?" Jake's laugh was ugly. "No, preacher in the territory would marry you to that animal. Whatever perverted arrangement you have here, it ends today." The 5 men with Jake shifted nervously, sensing they had stumbled into something more complex than they'd expected. But Jake, emboldened by drink and audience, pressed forward. "Step aside, Mum. We'll handle this quick and clean." That's when Bidzil spoke, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I have lived among your people, learned your laws, spoken your language, but I have never understood your need to control what brings others happiness. Why does our peace threaten yours?" Jake's hand moved toward his pistol. "Because decent folks don't truck with murdering heathens." The rifle in Cordelia's hands came up smoothly, her aim steady on Jake's chest. "The only person threatening murder here is you, boy. Now mount up and ride out, before this murdering heathen decides to show you what Apache justice looks like." Winter settled over the homestead like a blanket, bringing with it an unexpected peace. The confrontation with Jake Rutherford's gang had somehow solidified Cordelia and Bidzill's position in the small community's consciousness, if not acceptance, then at least wary tolerance. Word had spread that the Apache warrior was not to be trifled with, and that the widow Thorne could shoot as straight as any man. In the long evenings by the fire, their relationship deepened beyond necessity or companionship into something neither had dared hope for. Bidzill shared stories of his childhood, of learning to hunt with his father, of the vision quest that had shown him a different path than most warriors walked. Cordelia spoke of her marriage to Micah, how it had been built on mutual respect rather than passion, and how his death had left her functioning but not truly living. "I loved him," she said one snowy night, watching flames dance in the hearth, "but it was the love of a friend, a partner. I thought that was all love could be." Bidzill, who had been carving a wooden bowl, set down his knife, and now the question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Cordelia had been wrestling with this very thought for weeks, amazed by the intensity of what she felt for this gentle giant who had appeared in her life. Like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was saying. "Now I understand why poets write about love as fire," she said softly. "Why men go to war for it. Why women abandon everything familiar. What I feel for you. It's like being struck by lightning and somehow surviving, only to crave the next strike." He rose from his chair and knelt beside hers, taking her small hands in his massive ones. "In my vision quest, I saw a woman with hair like autumn grass and eyes like winter sky. She stood beside still water, and when she looked at me, I felt the earth settle into its proper place. I thought it was a dream of the spirit world. I never imagined she might be real, or that she might be waiting in a cabin I would find by chance." That night, they became husband and wife in the way that mattered most, not by any ceremony others might recognize, but by the complete surrender of two hearts that had found their match. The wind howled outside their cabin, but within warmth and tenderness created a world sufficient unto itself. Spring's rival brought new challenges. A territorial judge, responding to complaints from the more rigid members of the community, arrived to investigate reports of unlawful cohabitation. Judge Morrison was a fair man but bound by the laws of his time. He arrived expecting to find either a woman in distress or a scandalous arrangement that demanded legal intervention. Instead, he found Cordelia planting her garden while Bidzill repaired her plow, their easy conversation and obvious contentment painting a picture of domestic harmony that challenged his preconceptions. When he interviewed Cordelia privately, she spoke with quiet dignity about her choice and her happiness. "Ma'am, I understand your attachment," the judge said carefully, "but the law is clear about proper marriage without a recognized ceremony." "Judge Morrison," Cordelia interrupted with respect, "whose business is it how I find happiness on my own land? I pay my taxes, cause no trouble, and harm no one. If the law says I cannot love a good man because of his race, then perhaps the law needs examining, not my choices." The judge departed without taking action, but not before warning Cordelia that others might not be so understanding. His words proved prophetic when, a month later, a letter arrived from her sister in Kansas City. Lucinda had heard rumors about Cordelia's situation and was horrified. "You will come to your senses and return to civilization." The letter commanded, "I have arranged a position for you with a respectable family, and there are several widowers who would overlook your temporary madness for the sake of Christian charity. This savage infatuation must end before you are completely ruined." Cordelia read the letter aloud to Bidzill as they sat on their repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your family will cast you out for choosing me," he said finally. "My family cast me out long ago by caring more about appearances than my actual welfare." Cordelia replied, "The only family I need is sitting right here beside me." She threw the letter into their evening fire, watching her sister's words curl into ash. Some bonds, she reflected, were chosen rather than inherited, and those were often the strongest of all. 2 years had passed since that storm-torn night, when two Apache warriors had sought shelter, and Cordelia's homestead had transformed into something resembling a small ranch. Under Bidzill's patient guidance, she had learned to breed horses, and their small herd was gaining reputation throughout the territory for their strength and gentleness. The man who had once walked the warrior's path had found new purpose in nurturing life rather than taking it. Their success, however, brought unwanted attention. Land speculators had begun circling, recognizing the value of Cordelia's water rights and improved property. When she refused their increasingly aggressive offers, they resorted to more subtle pressures. Supply shipments began arriving late or not at all. Banking transactions were delayed with bureaucratic obstacles. The message was clear: sell or be slowly strangled out. The crisis came to a head when Nalnish returned, arriving alone and under cover of darkness. Cordelia woke to find the brothers in deep conversation by the corral, their voices tense with urgency. "The army is mobilizing," Nalnish reported. "General Crook has orders to round up all Apache not on reservations. There are bounties offered for warriors taken alive or dead. Your name is known, brother. They will come here." Bidzill's face showed no surprise, as if he had been expecting this news. "How long do we have?" "Days, perhaps a week. But there is more." Nalnish glanced toward the cabin where Cordelia stood silhouetted in the doorway. "The land men have offered the army information about your location in exchange for mineral rights surveys on this property. They mean to have it all the woman's land and your capture." Cordelia stepped into the circle of lamplight, her jaw set with determination. "Then we leave. All of us." "Where would we go?" Bidzill asked gently. "You cannot live as my people live, moving constantly, owning nothing a horse cannot carry. And I cannot live with the army's gold," Nalnish added. 20 men pursue me even now. By coming here, I have endangered you both." But Cordelia had been thinking, her mind racing through possibilities. "Canada," she said suddenly. "The mounted police don't recognize American bounties, and there are homestead opportunities north of the border. We could start again, all of us." The brothers exchanged glances. It was a desperate plan, but desperation often bred the clearest thinking. "You would leave everything you have built here?" Bidzill asked. "Everything I've built is standing right in front of me." Cordelia replied, "The land is just dirt without the people you love to share it with." They had 3 days to prepare. Working with the efficiency born of urgency, they gathered essential supplies, sold what livestock they couldn't take, and loaded to sturdy wagons with the tools and seeds needed to start fresh. Cordelia's heart broke leaving her garden, her carefully tended flower beds, the grave where Duke now rested after passing peacefully in his sleep the previous winter. But when she looked at Bidzill's face, seeing the hope that had replaced resignation, she knew they were making the right choice. On their final morning, as they prepared to depart, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Jake Rutherford approached, alone, but his manner was different, less arrogant, more purposeful. "Mrs. Thorne," he called out, dismounting with his hands visible. "I've come to warn you. The Army patrol is a day behind me, maybe less." Cordelia kept her rifle ready, but nodded for him to continue. "I know we've had our differences," Jake said, his voice carrying a maturity that hadn't been there 2 years ago. "But I've been watching you folks, seeing how you live, how you treat each other and everyone else. My pa was wrong, and I was wrong. What you have here, it's decent, more decent than most of what passes for civilization in these parts." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "This is a bill of sale, backdated 6 months, showing you sold this property to my father for fair market value. If anyone asks, you've been gone since autumn. I'll swear to it." Bidzill stepped forward, studying the young man's face. "Why would you do this?" Jake's smile was rueful. Because I spent 2 years expecting to see your scalps hanging from some war party's lances, or to find Mrs. Thorne murdered in her bed. Instead, I watched you build something good together, something that made the whole territory a little more peaceful. Maybe it's time I stopped fighting things that make the world better." As they shook hands, Apache warrior and cowboy's son Cordelia felt the rightness of it settle in her bones. Change was possible, even in the hardest hearts, perhaps especially there. The journey north took 3 weeks through back trails and forgotten passes that Nalnish remembered from his youth. They crossed into Canada on a clear April morning, the Rocky Mountains rising like promises on the western horizon. At the border, they became simply the Thorne family Cordelia, her husband William Bidzill's chosen English name, and his brother Nathan, seeking new opportunities in the Queen's Dominion. The homestead they claimed lay in a valley 60 miles north of the border, where a creek ran clear and cold from mountain springs. The land was rich but challenging, requiring the combined skills they had all developed over their lifetimes. Cordelia's frontier knowledge, Bidzill's understanding of the natural world, and Nalnish's warrior's adaptability proved a formidable combination. Their first year was hard but not desperate. The horse breeding program that had brought them success in Oklahoma translated well to the Canadian territory, where Royal Mounted Police and ranchers alike valued animals trained with Apache gentleness and frontier durability. Word spread about the quality of Thorne horses, and orders began arriving from as far away as Calgary and Edmonton. More importantly, they found acceptance in their new community, the small town of Clearwater Creek, 40 miles south of their homestead, had been settled by a mixture of former fur traders, displaced farmers, and others seeking fresh starts. Questions about the past were considered impolite, and a person's worth was measured by their contributions to community survival, rather than their bloodline. Bidzill, now calling himself William in public, but still Bidzill in the privacy of their home, found particular satisfaction in his new role. The territorial government was seeking men with knowledge of both native ways and frontier farming to help establish successful settlements. His unique background made him invaluable as a translator, mediator, and advisor. 3 years after their arrival, Cordelia discovered she was pregnant. At 37, she had never expected motherhood, but the child growing within her felt like the final piece of the life she and Bidzill had built together. Their daughter, born during a fierce winter storm, had her mother's autumn hair and her father's dark eyes, a bridge between worlds. Beautiful in her unique heritage, they named her Hope. Nalnish, who had found his own form of peace as a scout and guide for the mounted police, proved to be a devoted uncle. The stern warrior who had once lived only for battle now carved toys for his niece and taught her to ride before she could properly walk. Watching him teach Hope the traditional songs of their people while Cordelia read her English poetry, Bidzill often marveled at how life could reshape itself around love. On Hope's 5th birthday, as they celebrated with friends from Clearwater Creek, Cordelia found herself standing at the edge of their property, looking south toward the life they had left behind. Bidzill joined her, their daughter riding on his shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Leaving everything you knew for an uncertain future?" "I regret nothing that led us here," he replied, his arms circling her waist. "But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that storm had never come, if we had never sought shelter at your door." "I know exactly what would have happened," Cordelia said softly. "I would have died alone in that cabin, slowly and by degrees, never knowing what it meant to be truly alive. You would have spent your life searching for something you couldn't name, and this little one would never have existed to make the world brighter." Hope giggled from her perch on her father's shoulders, reaching up to touch the eagle feather he still wore in his hair, a reminder of who he had been and who he had chosen to become. As the sun set over their valley, painting the mountains purple and gold, the three of them stood together, complete in their unlikely family. The wind carried the scent of new grass and possibility, and somewhere in its whisper, Cordelia could almost hear the echo of that long-ago storm that had brought her the greatest shelter of all, not from weather, but from the loneliness that had nearly consumed her soul. Their love story had begun with desperation to strangers seeking refuge from different kinds of storms. It had grown through understanding, been tested by prejudice and fear, and had ultimately triumphed through the simple courage to choose happiness over safety, love over convention, and hope over despair. As they walked back toward their home, where Nalnish was already lighting the evening lamps, Cordelia reflected that the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding perfect happiness. They were about imperfect people creating something beautiful together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until what began as shelter became sanctuary, and what started as chance became destiny.